I'm truly honored to introduce Frank Allen, who will be speaking this evening on Liam O'Flaherty's The Informer, the novel, as well as the two films made of the book. Frank is a Dublin-born playwright, screenwriter, and director. He has been involved in grassroots art projects with the purpose of empowering working class and disadvantaged people, both as the creators as well as the consumers of art that is relevant to the working class experience. With this in mind, Frank founded Tabarna Rún Theatre Cooperative in 1991. Founding Tabarna Rún, or the Well of Secrets, was a challenge to mainstream elitism in Irish theatre, which shuts out the marginalized. The cooperative was set up to encourage those who wouldn't normally see it as their right to participate in that world, to give them a voice, to give them the wherewithal to express their experience. Frank has written and directed several stage plays, and his film work includes the Methadone Actors, the Daughter of Connolly, and his screenplay, 12 Days in May, a film he is making this autumn with Danny Boyle about the life of James Connolly. All of Frank's work on stage and in film gives a left-wing perspective on Irish history and the working class experience, the narratives that you will not hear about from the establishment writers, art, or the media. Frank was a teacher for 30 years at Ballyfermot College of Further Education and chairperson of the Dublin City post-primary branch of the Teachers' Union of Ireland. His last teaching post was in the Pathways Project, an educational service for ex-prisoners. In this evening's presentation, Frank examines Liam O'Flaherty's novel, The Informer, and how the narrative reflects O'Flaherty's worldview. Looking at the film versions, Frank will discuss how the directors adapted the novel and the changes they made, particularly in relation to Jippo's motivation for informing on Francis McPhilip. We thank Frank Allen very much for agreeing to give this talk and look forward to his presentation. Thank you.
I would like to thank the organisers for inviting me to speak to you about Liam O'Flaherty's novel, The Informer, and the subsequent film versions of his book. In assessing any piece of literature, I find it most useful to inquire into where the writer was in his life when he created this work. The years leading up to Liam O'Flaherty writing The Informer were indeed frenetic and full of adventure, including revolutionary activity in Ireland, and then the blossoming of his writing career in London. When Liam returned to Ireland from America in late 1921, he immersed himself in radical politics, joining with Roddy Connolly, son of James Connolly, in founding the Communist Party of Ireland. O'Flaherty became editor of the Workers' Republic. This, of course, was the time of the treaty negotiations in London, and in early 1922, after the establishment of the Irish Free State, O'Flaherty, in his role as chairman of the Council of the Unemployed, took over the Rotunda Concert Hall and held it for 4 days, flying a red flag above the building. He took part in the Civil War on the anti-treaty side, but after the surrender of the Republicans, he left for London, disillusioned and penniless. As we move into 1923, he came under the guidance of Karl Lahr, a German socialist who ran the Progressive Bookshop, and Liam's writing career took off in earnest. Lahr and his wife befriended him and looked after him. He was surrounded by many other progressive writers, people like D.H. Lawrence and Aldous Huxley. His first short story, The Sniper, and his first novel, Thy Neighbour's Wife, were published, and he entered into a most prolific period. He returned to Dublin in 1924 and co-founded the Radical Club and linked up with Pádraig Ó Connra and Harry Kernoff. In 1925, The Informer was published and had huge success. Sean O'Casey's great tenement play, Juno and the Paycock, was staged in the Abbey Theatre in 1924, and one of the characters, Danny Boyle, was also accused of informing, so the topic was current and very stimulating for Irish audiences in that very turbulent era. Liam O'Flaherty's Informer could be described as written in the expressionistic style. It was described as a style which was anti-imperialist and which originated in Germany. Many of the writers in O'Flaherty's progressive circle in London experimented with expressionism, and it had influenced writers in Ireland as well. The Dublin Drama League performed the leading German playwright Ernst Toller's play Masses and Man at the Abbey in January 1925, the same year as the publication of The Informer. Expressionism in literature is seen as a revolt against realism and naturalism. It meant that the narrative style wasn't linear or that events were outlined in logical sequence. Its aim was to evoke moods and ideas and dealt with the psychological and spiritual makeup of the leading characters. Expressionism is heavily laced with symbolism, and the religious symbolism in the concluding scenes of The Informer typify this style. In painting, Van Gogh would be seen as a leading light in the expressionist movement. The paintings create a highly charged emotional response. Subjects are often distorted or exaggerated. O'Flaherty's descriptions of his characters' psychological states follow this expressionistic tradition. In music, it would have a high level of dissonance, and we will discuss this aspect later when we talk about the films. In reference back to Sean O'Casey, who Liam O'Flaherty would be well aware of, a few years later, of course, his play The Silver Tassie was very much written in the expressionistic style and of course was turned down by W.B. Yeats at the Abbey. O'Flaherty sets out in The Informer to create this world of blurred reality. The opening pages present a dreary, dismal world lacking any hope of redemption. Francis Joseph MacPhilip, a wanted man on the run for murder, approaches the Dunby lodging house. The writing is so atmospheric. The house, as it was called in Dublin among criminal and pauperised circles, was a grey concrete building of 4 stories. A maze of slum streets surrounded it. An indefinable smell of human beings living in a congested area filled the air around it. From the building itself, a smell of food and of floors being scrubbed with soap and hot water emanated. But it is in his powers of description of his main characters that O'Flaherty really distinguishes himself. Of MacPhillips, he says, he was a man of middle age with slightly built, but his shoulders were broad enough for a giant. His body narrowed down from the shoulders so that his hips and waist were totally out of proportion to the upper part of the body. His right leg opened outwards in a curve below the knee, and he placed the toe of the right foot on the ground before the heel when he walked, so that his walk had the crouching appearance of a wild animal stalking in a forest. His face was thin and sallow. His hair was black and cropped close. His eyebrows were black and bushy. His eyelashes were long and they continually dropped over his eyes. When his eyelashes drooped, his eyes were blue, sharp and fierce. But when he raised his lashes for a moment to think of something different and perhaps imaginary, his eyes were large, wistful and dreamy. They were soft and full of sorrow that was unfashionable. His jaws were square, sharp and fleshless. His lips were thin and set tightly. This gave the lower part of his face a ferocious appearance. His nose was long and straight. His cheeks were hollow, and on the cheekbones a bright flush appeared when he was seized with a fit of hard, dry coughing, which he tried to suppress. Van Gogh would certainly have no problem painting MacPhilip from Liam O'Flaherty's verbal portrait. It must have been wonderful for a director of a film to be able to share this vision that the writer had of his characters. This is followed by all his character descriptions in The Informer, and in this regard he is up there with Charles Dickens. I was always struck by this quality in Dickens' character portraits. For example, how he described Mr. Gradgrind in Hard Times. What is interesting in this style is that it is not static. The character's movement is highlighted, and the description reveals psychological aspects of the character and often also their social skills. He is similar in this regard also to O'Casey. For example, O'Casey's description of Flute Good in The Plough and the Stars. He is a man of 40 years of age, rarely surrendering to thoughts of anxiety, fond of his isle, but determined to conquer the habit before he dies. He is square-jawed and harshly featured. Under the left eye is a scar, and his nose is bent from a smashing blow received in a fistic battle long ago. The similarities are there to be seen. A radical writer like Liam O'Flaherty could easily fall into the trap of allowing his work become a vehicle for propaganda. His work could easily become soapbox, preaching, or advocating for his own particular radical view of the world. O'Flaherty never does, and always remains professionally detached. He allows his characters, through their dialogue and actions, reveal the writer's own conviction. A very good example of this is highlighted very early in The Informer, in Dunby lodging house. He describes the ill treatment meted out to a destitute man dressed in a medley of unspeakable rags. His description of the offending official reveals all. Presently he reappeared from around the corner of the office. He came up to the old man and stood in front of him with his hands on his hips and his legs spread wide apart. His neat blue trousers were perfectly creased. He was in his shirt sleeves, so that his diamond sleeve links and the large diamond in his tie flashed in the half-darkness. His hair was glued to his head with perfumed oil. Its odour pervaded the whole hallway. He looked at the old man with an expression of mixed contempt and anger. "If I catch you here again, you old fool, I'll hand you over to the police. Go away now and get into the workhouse where you belong." The action and the narrative does all the work. We have no doubts where O'Flaherty's loyalty and compassion lies. The meeting of Francis MacPhilip and Jip O'Nolan in the Dunby lodging house is wonderfully constructed. The tension is built up as Francis furtively searches room after room looking for Jippo. When he eventually finds him, Jippo is in the process of savaging a large plate of potatoes, cabbage and bacon. Francis demands information, but Jippo is engrossed in filling his belly. This scene is central to examining Jippo's real motivation for informing on Francis MacPhilip. And when we look at the cinematic versions of the book, the directors obviously looked more at the romantic dalliances to justify Jippo's reason for going to the police. But O'Flaherty clearly indicates in this scene in Dunby House the dilemma Jippo found himself in. He was struck at that moment by an insane and monstrous idea. Two facts rumbled about in his brain, making that loud primeval noise, which is the beginning of thought and which tired people experience when the jaded brain has spun out the last threads of its energy. There were two facts in his brain. First, the fact of his meeting with MacPhilip. Second, the fact of his having no money to buy a bed for the night. These two facts stood together in an amorphous mass. Within a few hours, Francis MacPhilip is dead and Jippo has collected £20 in treasury notes. But as he entered a dark lane and heard a footstep, his existence had utterly changed. The footstep made him start. It was the first human footstep he had heard, the first sound of his fellow human beings since he had become an informer and an outcast. In the bar scene with Katie Fox, he reacts violently when Katie innocently utters the word "inform her." Paranoia is now going to be his lot, and potential enemies are lurking everywhere. The world of the informer is grim and grey, and there is nothing light or frivolous in it. And yet there is one hilarious exchange between Katie and Jippo. God Almighty, the world is so hard that a person loses her mind altogether. Misery, 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 and nothing but misery. You're as bad off as myself, Jippo, so you know what I mean. No man has pity on us. Every hand is against us now because we have nothing. Why is that, will you tell me, Jippo? Is God himself against us too? Ha! Of course, we were both of us communists and members of the revolutionary organisation, so we know there's no God. But supposing there was a God, what the hell is he doing? Katie, cried Jippo angrily, none of that talk. Leave God alone. God forgive me, you're right, cried Kate. It's an absolutely hilarious piece of dialogue, as I said, in the background, which is dim, and at that stage, of course, he's already feeling the paranoia. Despite Jippo's paranoia, instinct told him that in order to avoid the inevitable accusations, he was duty-bound to visit McPhilip's house in Tilt Street. Everywhere, in the streets, in the public houses, in the tenement kitchens, where old red-nosed men craned forward their shrivelled necks to hear the dreadful news, one word was whispered with fear and hatred. It was the word informer. He knew he had to speak to Mrs. McPhilip, and when he got to the house, she held Jippo's attention like a powerful magnet. He was thinking how good she had been to him. She had often fed him, and she would often press half a crown into Jippo's hand when nobody was looking, whispering, "May the Virgin protect you, and won't you look after Frankie and see that he comes to no harm?" Now, looking at the distraught mother, those memories of her kindness haunted him, and his guilt was immeasurable. The reaction of Jack McPhilip, Frankie's father, to Jippo reveals a lot about the politics of the revolutionary organisation. It's the likes of him that's brought Frankie to his death and destruction. Them and their revolutions. It's in Russia they should be, where they could act the cannibal as much as they like, instead of leading good Irishmen astray. Though Jack McPhilip was a trade union leader and an avowed socialist, the politics of the revolutionary organisation was seen as alien to Ireland, which still had that backdrop of nationalism, patriotism and Catholicism. O'Flaherty still had faith in the Bolsheviks and described the USSR as that workshop where the civilization of the future is being hammered out. But even Jippo, when he feels the accusatory glances of Bartley Mulholland and Tommy Connor, questions their sincerity. "I ain't working, and all of you fellas that were supposed to be comrades of mine, take damn good care to keep out of the way, for fear I might ask you for the price of a feed or a flop. You're a queer lot of communists." When he is brought before Commandant Dan Gallagher, the irony of Gallagher's words are not lost on Jippo. But an informer is an informer. He's got to be wiped out like the first sign of a plague as soon as he's spotted. He's a common enemy. He's got to be got, Jippo, and it's up to you to give us a hand in tracking the traitor that sent your pal to his death. If you can give us a clue to the man that informed on Francis McPhilip, I'll get you taken back again into the organisation at your old job on headquarters staff. So Jippo was prepared to lay the blame on the rat Mulligan to save his own skin, and Jippo was summoned to attend the court of inquiry. A huge part of the plot is bound up with the brothels like Biddy Burke's and the more salubrious Aunt Betty's, where Jippo's wild spending leads to gossip and jealousies and eventually leads to Katie Fox, his ire at being spurned by Jippo. The destitution and the prostitution were a huge part of life in the city. O'Casey represented this element of society in The Plough and the Stars, which played in the Abbey in 1926, the year after the publication of O'Flaherty's The Informer. The character of Rosie Redmond was the equivalent of Katie Fox or Connemara Maggie. After being sentenced to death by the revolutionary organisation, Jippo manages to escape from the bogey hole. After a night of wandering around the cold, bleak city, he seeks refuge in Katie Fox's room in Mount William Crescent near the church. Katie is sharing the room with an old woman, Louisa Cummins, and after Gippo falls asleep, Katie leaves the house to tell the revolutionary organisation of his whereabouts. Louisa tries to waken him. "Ah, she's gone to inform on you, me fine boyo. They'll soon be after you. Trust a woman, trust the devil. She'll be the ruin of you, me bowed warrior." The writing in the final chapter is so eloquent and lyrical. Continuing in that expressionistic style, the concluding narrative is full of symbolism. When the badly shot up Gippo crawls into the church, he walked through the iron gateway of the church, along the concrete path to the door. He had to crawl up the steps on his knees. Blood was coming up his throat. Reverently, he dipped his hand in the holy water font. He tried to take off his hat in order to cross himself. Mrs. MacPhilip was in the congregation attending early mass. He set out with a great sigh towards her. He fell in a heap in front of her seat. He raised his head to her face. He saw her face, a great, white, sad face with tears running down the fat cheeks. He swallowed the blood in his mouth and he cried out in a thick whisper, "Mrs. MacPhilip, 'twas I informed on your son Frankie. Forgive me, I'm dying." "I forgive you," she sighed in a sad, soft whisper. "You didn't know what you were doing." He shivered from head to foot and bowed his head. He felt a great mad rush of blood to his head. A great joy filled him. He became conscious of infinite things, mercy and pity and peace. The conclusion is almost triumphant. He stood up straight, in all the majesty of his giant stature, towering over it all, erect and majestic, with his limbs like pillars, looking towards the altar. He cried out in a loud voice, "Frankie, your mother has forgiven me." O'Flaherty maintains this religious symbolism to the very last. Then, with a gurgling sound, he fell forward on his face. Blood gushed from his mouth. He stretched out his limbs in the shape of a cross. He shivered and lay still. Seeking forgiveness from the mother seemed to redeem Gippo and allowed him die before the altar rather than in the gutter. I'm now going to have a look at the cinematic versions of the book, The Informer. The first one was the 1929 version by Arthur Robison. Although this film was produced in an English studio at Elstree, it was very much an international film and drew on serious international talent. This included the German-American director Arthur Robison, the German cinematographers Werner Brandes and Theodor Sparkle, and the leading actors Swedish Lars Hansen playing Gippo Nolan, and the Hungarian actress Leah Deputy as Katie Fox. The Informer was made during the transition to sound, in silent and part-talkie versions, but the silent version is far superior. It was produced in the late 1920s, European style, with a dark, shadowy texture and a claustrophobic look. Although it was shot in studio, it did give a very authentic look to Dublin, and the cinema, the Parnell Hall, the Green Street railway station and the narrow laneways all added to the heightened drama. The film opens with a party meeting chaired by Captain Gallagher and attended by Gippo Nolan, Francis MacPhilip and Katie Fox. Katie Fox in Robison's film is a milliner, a member of the party and not a lady of the night as in O'Flaherty's novel. There is an early reference to shooting coming from the other side, which could have represented the political divide in 1922 Ireland. When their meeting is fired on by the other side, the police arrive and Francis MacPhilip shoots the chief of police. It is a very dramatic opening and the pace of the action never slackens or flags. We already see in this first scene that Gippo has romantic notions about Katie, who at this time is with Francis MacPhilip. This love triangle will become the central theme in Robson's adaptation. The cinematography accentuates this theme as most of the shooting is mid-shots and close-ups. A great example of this is in the early scene when Katie tries to hide Francis from Jippo. When Jippo feels that Katie is unfaithful, the close-ups reveal his angst and his mood swing, which will propel him to inform on Francis out of a jealous rage. The BFI's recently restored version of the 1929 film includes a newly commissioned music score by Garth Knox. Knox was keen to restore something of its Irishness. He included uilleann pipes and accordion in the instrumentation. With an authority figure like Captain Gallagher, Knox used a lot of drum and bass in order to show flute music capturing the tortured lover in scenes with Katie Fox. One lovely sequence is where Katie puts on the gramophone to distract Jippo from having any knowledge of Francis being in the other room. The record plays Danny Boyle, but when Jippo finds out about Francis, he throws a bottle of Guinness at the gramophone to stop the deceit. The music at the dance in Parnell Hall is very appropriate and lively and shifts the narrative from the narrow, seedy world outside to the world of real Dubliners enjoying their night out. I enjoyed the way the narrative was moved along by the use of letters, posters and writing in pen and ink. When Francis is on the run up in the Dublin mountains, he receives a letter from the party containing a wad of money to encourage him to flee to America. The camera allows us read the letter clearly, which is vital to our understanding of the action to follow. The handwriting is obviously very good and legible. The wanted poster is also very cleverly used. We see Francis observing the poster when he returns to the city to say goodbye to his mother. He pulls most of it off the wall and attracts the attention of a policeman. This adds to the future tension and sense of danger and surveillance. Later, when Jippo feels that he has been deceived by Katie and that she will run off to America with him, we see him standing in front of the wanted poster. We are left in absolutely no doubt as to his next step. When Jippo informs on Francis in the police station and is offered the reward money, he is asked to sign for it. The camera focuses on the signature in pen and ink to heighten dramatic effect. The signature copper fastens his treachery. When we compare the novel to the film adaptations, Jippo's motivation for informing on Francis MacPhilip has to be examined. In Robeson's version, Jippo says to the policeman, "I didn't do it for the money." Linking the informing to an act of jealous rage because of a love triangle involving Katie, Francis and Jippo completely changes the narrative from Liam O'Flaherty's novel. This has a knock-on effect on how Jippo's character has to be portrayed by the actor. Lars Hansen's performance is moody and masterful, but he is definitely not the Jippo Nolan as created by O'Flaherty. Lars Hansen is the handsome leading man, whereas O'Flaherty's Jippo is wild and brutish. It is interesting to read what O'Flaherty's own stated purpose was for The Informer. In 1934 he wrote, "I worked out the plan of The Informer, determined it should be a sort of highbrow detective story and its style based on the technique of the cinema. It should have all the appearance of a realistic novel, and yet the material should hardly have any connection with real life. I would treat my readers as a mob orator treats his audience and toy with their emotions, making them finally pity a character whom they began by considering a monster." This identification with the anti-hero in a narrative was definitely central to O'Flaherty's purpose. It reminded me very much of Emily Bronte's portrayal of Heathcliff. Robeson replaces the brothel scenes with a new scene in the railway station. Bessie, who has been bullied and ill-treated by the bar owner, wins Jippo's sympathy and he pays her debt in order to free her from the brute. It was a very clever device because when Bessie presents Jippo with a signed photo, this photo eventually leads to Katie Fox betraying Jippo to Captain Dan Gallagher from a fit of pique. Robeson's adaptation cleverly showed MacPhilip being hunted down by the police in a dramatic shootout on the roof of the house. The tension was heightened by the gathering of the crowd and by MacPhilip's mother witnessing his death from the ground and collapsing in a heap. Robeson was very faithful to O'Flaherty's novel in the final scenes in the church, Gypo seeking forgiveness from Mrs. MacPhilip and declaring this out loud to Francis allows the film finish with Gypo collapsing in the form of a crucifix and achieving some kind of redemption. In 1935, John Ford made his version of The Informer. The opening sequences during the credits immediately stamp John Ford's intention for the film. It is also expressionistic, leading more to European influences than American. The creation of a world full of shadows and silhouettes is consistent with the theme, a claustrophobic society without hope and seemingly without any escape. It has been declared as film noir before that genre was properly established. This representation of destitute Dublin during the War of Independence is enhanced by creating an atmosphere of dense fog, shadows and glistening cobblestones. The opening sequence has hardly any dialogue until Katie cries out Gypo's name. Max Steiner's award-winning score perfectly matches the dramatic narrative. The continuous use of the posters juxtaposes Gypo's dilemma. The £20 reward on Francis MacPhilip's wanted poster and the £10 passage ticket for America. John Ford sets the scenes up beautifully, and this allows him not resort to so much exposition. For example, the first time we see Gypo looking at the wanted poster, we sense his disgust, and he touches Frankie's face affectionately. He tears the poster up with anger and throws it to the ground, but as he walks away, the poster blows in the wind and catches up on his leg. Definitely a very subtle metaphor for what is to come, the fact that he is entangled by the poster and what it might suggest. Like the 1929 Robeson film, Ford links Gypo's motivation more with his relationship with Katie and wanting to escape for a new life in America with her. But there is a huge contrast between Ford's Gypo Nolan and the 1929 version. It was indeed a masterstroke by John Ford in casting the ex-pugilist in the role. He played a stormer in the role and is far closer to Liam O'Flaherty's portrayal of the brutish giant down on his luck and involved in a self-destructive drunken spree inspired by paranoia and guilt. Victor McLachlan is absolutely marvellous in the film and very, very close to the outline given in Liam O'Flaherty's book. There is another lovely example of Ford's thought process in framing his scenes like paintings, where Gypo is feeling the pressure in the public house. He grips the bottle of stout in his left hand and tells the audience that he needs a plan. Then he hears Frankie's voice telling him that he needed his brains to draw up a plan. His deed is already haunting him. The fact that Ford named the Black and Tans as the agency that Gypo gives the information to was also a clever ploy because he was well aware of their tarnished and hated reputation. This also magnified Gypo's sense of guilt, betraying his old pal to the old enemy. The trial scene or kangaroo court is excellently presented. Captain Gallagher was determined that due process was evident, and the slow breaking down of Gypo revealed him as a pathetic figure. When Gallagher can detail the spending of every penny of the informer's £20, we see Gypo like a rat in a trap. Gallagher pleads with him to ease his soul, and it is then that Gypo cries out continually, "I didn't know what I was doing." When Mary MacPhilip pleads with Captain Gallagher, he states emphatically that it is nothing personal and that the informer puts the whole organisation in jeopardy. The tension in the scene and the calling of witnesses was masterfully controlled. John Ford's The Informer is faithful to Liam O'Flaherty's novel, in presentation and in its use of symbolism. The themes of betrayal and redemption are the same, and the religious imagery is exploited in a similar fashion. Gypo's world is closing in on him emotionally and psychologically. He has been demoted by the IRA and is now under almost constant surveillance. He leaves a trail of mounting suspicion after him, and the scene at Frankie's wake is one of the best examples of this. The faces, the numerous observers are highlighted after Gippo spills his informer's money on the floor. The religious themes are introduced early. Then Judas repented himself and cast down the 30 pieces of silver and departed. And of course the final scene in the church where the dying Gippo begs forgiveness from Mrs. McPhilip. I think that the ending achieves what O'Flaherty set out to do in the 1925 novel. In spite of the brutalness, the drunken rampages, the betrayal of his best pal, the audience seemed to want him having an avenue for redemption. The ebb and flow of human sympathy is remarkable. The audience are now ironically on the side of the anti-hero. One interesting footnote was that the prize the film won at Venice was the Mussolini Cup. I'm very sure that Liam O'Flaherty was no fan of Il Duce. In looking at the two films and in looking at the novel, the films were absolutely marvellous adaptations of the novel, but the real genius is in Liam O'Flaherty's writing.